Kia ora tātou, ko Andrew Doubleday aho. Welcome to this video presentation of our Gospel Lectionary reading for Sunday the 7th of November 2021. If you've been following, you'll notice that the location has changed. Yes, we have shifted house and we're now living at Lincoln. There'll be some features that you'll see that are common. There's the sofa behind and the painting on the wall, which is of the current Opawa Church. And you're very welcome. Today we're looking at Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44. And it's a passage that we generally know as the story of the widow's mite. But this has got a little bit extra to it. So we're going to pick it up, again as I said, in verse 38. And we're going to read Mark chapter 12. As he taught, Jesus said, "Beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues, and places of honour at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury, and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "I tell you truly, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Now this passage is also found in Luke chapter 21. In both Gospels, very closely follow one another. And in both Gospels, it follows an identical invective against the leeching of the scribes. Mark 12 and 40, and Luke 20 and 47, both exactly the same words. They devour widows' houses and make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely. Now normally we would look at the story of the widow's what? We would look at the story of the widow's mite as a standalone. But the lectionary, I believe, helpfully points out that it follows directly on from this tirade against the scribes. There is a connection. Ironically, in Mark's Gospel, this follows immediately on from the incident involving the scribe that Jesus affirmed from last week, where he said, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." They weren't all bad. And Eugene Peterson, in The Message, he describes the scribes as the religion scholars. One commentary that I consulted with suggested that these were people who didn't get paid. They weren't to be paid. So they solicited donations in much the same way that prosperity teaches to do today, on the promise of the favour of God as you give until it hurts. And who are those who most readily fall for this kind of a pitch? It's those that don't have, generally the poor and desperate people. People who have nowhere else to go. Their future looks bleak without some intervention. And so often it's the poor ones who end up spending what little they have. We have it in our own culture. What do they spend it on? Things like lottery tickets, things like the pokies. It's a sign not of their stupidity, it's a sign of their desperation. A hope for the big win that will lift them out of the awful circumstances in which they find themselves. Something of this, I want to suggest, is reflected in a good deal of the way that people respond to prosperity teaching. Giving to God, to make an investment in the kingdom of God, and God will reward you. And so often making an investment in the kingdom will remain rewarding the one who's asking for the money. Ultimately, they get richer, while the poor get poorer. And so here we have, in the time of Jesus, a day without a social safety net. Who were the most vulnerable? There were no benefits for people to help people. Who were the ones who were the most readily in the gun? It was the widows. Who was at greatest risk of losing it all, of having their houses sold from underneath them? It was widows. It was in a day when income security was dependent on the man that you had in your life. And in those days, the status of the widow was perilous, particularly if she had dependents. So we can ask the question, was Jesus affirming the widow for her generosity in giving away her last 2 coins? Or was he lamenting the desperate straits in which she found herself and the way in which she was being preyed on by religious leaders who would pry even the little hair that she had from her fingers? Yeah, could have been both. My hunch is that these religion scholars didn't even notice her desperation. Was Jesus commending her faith in God, or was his heart aching for her in her poverty? Yes, I suspect both. I've had some weeks reflecting on this passage. There are quite a few options to consider. It could be that she was down to her last 2 copper coins, then nothing, and that this act of giving it away was one final act in reclaiming her dignity. How could that be? Could it be that this is what was in the poor widow's heart? Giving what she has, even though it's so little? Yes, I've done that. Or is this poor widow putting in her last 2 coins as a commitment to freedom? How could that be a commitment to freedom, you might ask? Well, it may be that she's been hanging on to these as her security. They're all that she has left, trusting to 2 copper coins, obsessed with hanging on to them. They're all she has standing between her and the great void of unknowing about what happens next. In reality, many of us are in a similar place. We just don't realize it. Putting our faith in what we have. We just don't recognize this to be the case, because we're not down to the end of our resources, or the last 2 bits of our resources, as this poor widow was. To give them away may be an act of faith, because they no longer control her life. She's actually, at one level, she's free. What happens next? She doesn't know. What she does know is that her life is no longer dependent on these 2 copper coins. She's just given them away. At one level, as I've suggested, it's possible she now sees herself in some bizarre way as being free. She can only trust in God that her next meal will come from somewhere. Is this naive? Perhaps. And yet you can look down the history of the church and see people who have actually done exactly this and found that they haven't been left wanting, always at the last minute or beyond the last minute. Something so often has come through and happened. It could be the ultimate act of faith. She no longer needs to obsess about protecting the little she has, because she has nothing. She now has little choice but to trust. We're challenged, aren't we, by different ways of seeing. The desperate faith of this poor widow who gives all she had, either out of a genuine love for God in giving what she could, or in response to the call of the scribes to make an investment in what she had left to see what God would do with it, or as an act of rebellion against the system that defined her by what she didn't have. How did it work out for her, this widow in Jesus' story? We're not told. Yet she leaves a challenge for us to have the generous heart of faith that still trusts God in our emptiness and lack. And there's a challenge of the scribes, devout, religious people, full of their own self-importance and how blessed they are by God, completely lacking awareness that their self-serving beliefs, teachings and behaviours may be robbing the most vulnerable around them of the basic necessities of life. And what we know about Jesus is that he finds that outrageous. It's easy to imagine when things are going well for us that we're one of God's special favourites, and deserving of all the blessings, the material blessings that come our way. We, Lynn and I, have just moved into our own home after living in accommodation provided by the church for the last 35 years. It feels a little surreal. I long imagined that we would end up in a council flat, as long as it was hopefully warm and dry, from which I could be carted out in a pine box when I was finally done. Yet here we are, a real house, a real home. It's beautiful, owned by us and the bank. I'm not really sure what to make of it. So blessing has come our way. Is it because we're deserving? No, I don't think that's how it works. All I can do is wonder and be grateful. And what of the poor in the prosperity worldview? And we'd never say it out loud. People who are poor are obviously standing outside of God's blessing. There must be some sin in their lives. They're getting what they deserve, so we need have no sympathy for them. And that's how a lot of people think. And that's outrageous. It's a slur against the nature and character of God. And it's a denial of the Jesus who invites his followers to take up the cross and follow him. So where does this leave us? Well, I have no clear answers. I can only live with a measure of gratitude for the life that I have, and be aware that others are not as privileged, and do what little bit I can to help. And hope and trust that it all worked out for the poor widow who gave all she had. I have a segue as a postscript. There's a wonderful movie, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. And this hotel run in this, I think, unnamed Indian city where a group of English pensioner escapees go to get a better life, is run by a hapless young man named Johnny. Hapless, yes, but he has a good heart. And he has a simple little mantra, and he says this a number of times. He says, it'll all work out in the end. And if it hasn't worked out, it's not yet the end. Now, I'd like to believe that he was right. I've so often seen it to be the case. There are no guarantees. I can still hope and pray that it's true for you and for me. God bless you.